Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Think Tank Europa's webinar on the upcoming election in Turkey. This is today our fourth episode in a series of European elections, but it is surely the most dramatic case we've dealt with so far. And a very warm welcome to you, Asli Aydintasbas, calling in from Istanbul.
Thank you, Rasmus.
We're happy to have you here today. My name is Rasmus Foss, and I've really been looking forward to this, not only because there's so much at stake, and of course so much to discuss, but also, or especially, because I know no one who's better suited to guide us through it and to put it all into a European perspective than you. You have had a prominent career as a journalist, both in your home country, Turkey, and as well in the United States, where you got your education. And today you work at one of our favorite think tanks, the European Council on Foreign Relations. But these days, you are a visiting fellow at Brookings Institution in Washington, and also a Washington Post columnist. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
When you were in Istanbul 2 months ago, you described the city as a boiler room that was filled with tensions and a lot of polarization. And now, just 4 days before the elections on Sunday, there will be both presidential and parliamentary elections. What's the atmosphere like in the city? What's in the air?
Well, it's a good place to start. I just arrived late last night from Berlin. But when I was in Berlin, Turkish elections had already started because every cab driver, every Uber driver, that I ran into, and there are many people of Turkish descent, or every German that I struck a conversation with would immediately go into Turkish elections. So, yes. It was in March when I was in Turkey, it felt like a boiler room, huge anxiety. It was post-earthquake, but already the earthquake debate had merged into the election debate with huge amount of polarization. And it's double that now. There is, I was just out. I had a couple of meetings and then I went to a doctor's office and there isn't a single person that I interacted with, which included the butcher, the receptionist at the doctor's office, the friends on the phone, the journalists, and who hadn't talked about, including the doctor who hadn't talked about the election and expressed a great amount of anxiety, because the way this election is framed is it's two camps. The governing coalition, which is essentially a far-right nationalist coalition, nationalist Islamist coalition, and the opposition made up of a diverse group of 6 parties, but led by a social democrat, secular social democrat. There cannot be any more different world visions. They're offering diametrically different, opposed world visions of where they want to take Turkey. And not just that, but both sides feel the other winning is an existential threat for their existence. So that makes it a really high stakes gamble and a nerve-wracking situation. The only country that I know that I have covered and visited during electoral cycles that has a similar existential anxiety about elections is not the United States, although it's getting there. It's Israel, and this feels very, very similar. Obviously, you have President Erdogan's coalition who's making a case that Erdogan's campaign is that Turkey is surrounded by enemies and is internally targeted by enemies, that the opposition coalition is backed by terrorists. He, in fact, says this openly. These are not my interpretations of what he says. The opposition coalition is backed by terrorists, PKK, and the West. Essentially, what they want is to prevent Turkey's rise, which in his eyes is inevitable. His campaign is based on these big infrastructure projects that he's done, a lot on Turkey's homegrown defense industry, first aircraft carrier, the drones, different types of drones, Turkey's various, war machines, homegrown, domestic defense industry, all saying that he's out there to make Turkey great again, rebuilding the empire and getting Turkey to where it's destined to be. In his explanation, this would be a global role, but most likely, realistically, he understands to be a regional leadership role. And the opposition coalition has, their main platform is democracy, pledging to return Turkey's democratic backsliding. But they have also made a very compelling enough case, that Turkey's economic problems, that's a big issue for voters, but that Turkey's economic problems can only be addressed if we were to change the governance system from a one-man regime run by Erdogan to back to parliamentary democracy. So they have made that linkage with the economy and the decision-making system, the governance system in Turkey, in quite a compelling way. Perhaps their weakness is the candidate himself, in the sense that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is, of course, has been around for a long time and has led CHP, the main opposition party, but he wasn't the most formidable candidate when we started discussing election a year or two ago. Most people thought that it would be the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, or the mayor of Ankara, Mansur Yavaş, who were polling far ahead of Erdogan, at times 15, 20 points ahead of Erdogan. But for various internal reasons, and because he has been the architect of this coalition, opposition coalition of 6 parties of different political backgrounds, Kılıçdaroğlu positioned himself as the opposition positioned Kılıçdaroğlu as the nominee. He is not offering to be a version of Erdogan. He's a very different man, a thoughtful, 74-year-old social democrat, soft-spoken, and with a track record of fighting corruption and all of that. But he's not, I think he's positioning himself as a version of Joe, as some type of a Turkish answer to Joe Biden, a Turkish Biden, in the sense that he is not the exact image of this very macho and charismatic leader, because he's not always seen as a charismatic leader, but he's the architect of an opposition coalition, in order, the transition candidate, the guy who will take Turkey through this period of democratization, re-democratization. We'll see what voters will say for this proposition. The polls were showing, Erdogan quite behind, but there's been a very systematic campaign and an information war and a little bit of post-truth campaigning going on over the past month. President Erdogan has also been rolling out, just yesterday, 45% wage increase. He's been rolling out various infrastructure projects and sort of, stipends and handouts, etc. And meanwhile, the opposition is mobilized, has energy. They think they're winning. They think this is the time. And it's not just Kılıçdaroğlu, but also Ekrem İmamoğlu, also the other candidates, and they're all in different parts of the country addressing to the different constituencies. The government's main case is that they are, particularly in targeted information campaigns, social media campaigns, and even in Erdogan's speeches, he says that they're backed by terrorists and PKK, not only because the opposition coalition is backed externally by the pro-Kurdish party, which it is, but they also claim that they have had negotiations with the PKK and promised autonomy. Obviously, this is not true, but it's like such a consistent theme in Erdogan's speeches and in WhatsApp groups and in social media campaigns that I think it is really consolidated the Sunni conservative voters that were over the past few weeks that were undecided, unhappy about the economic situation, uncertain about the direction of the country. Turkey is a very big and complicated country, 85, 86 million people from different socio-economic backgrounds, also different ethnicities and even sectarian divisions. But I think that it is fair to say, and I'll end here, it's fair to say the majority of Turks want change. There's no doubt in my mind. When I talk to younger people, when I talk to urban middle class, when I talk to Kurds, the majority does want change. It's just a question of whether they think Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is the change agent, whether they're willing to give that mandate to Kılıçdaroğlu or not. I am not making any predictions because I think at this point it's a toss-up. It's very close, neck and neck. So maybe I've spoken already too much, but I'll pass it back on to you.
Yeah, it's great that we already have questions coming in. As is in the chat, you're more than welcome to ask, and you can send them by writing in the chat. So you've already opened up so many of the questions that we'll circle around, and this is a very complex election, you can hear. It's a lot to keep in mind. But if you have to boil it down, and given all of this to keep in mind, what is likely when the Turkish voter, the average Turkish voter, is in the voting booth on Sunday? What is likely to be top of mind? And to someone not involved in politics, how does the choice between Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu appear to them? You say that the majority want change, but what is it specifically that would be top of mind on Sunday? If you should predict?
Look, in elections, people vote for ideas, but they also vote for themselves. And this country has had last year triple-digit inflation. That is a very real thing. People are poorer than they were last year, poorer than they were 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's also the case that they are extremely unhappy about a number of things, including a bit of a social, I think, growing disgruntlement about the refugees, about the overall structure of the economy, and issues like corruption. On the other hand, if you can make a case to the public that it will be better under your leadership, you get to win elections. Elections are about whoever has a better pitch for hope, whoever paints a better life for the voter. And while the opposition claims there is a blue wave that, and while I have said the majority wants change, some people will be convinced enough through the campaign over this past month that President Erdogan can make their lives better. He's already, rolling out these campaigns and programs. So I don't think he can turn the economy around. His track record has been very much about an almost erratic mismanagement of the economy. It's like a revolving door, central bank governor fired another one, and he essentially is in charge of the economy himself, and also has insisted on not just doing away with the independence of central bank and Turkey's economic institutions, but the independence of Turkey's economic institutions, but insisting on his own economic theories, fight against interest rates and insisting on a growth model that is largely construction driven and construction and infrastructure driven. That's not what Turkey needs at the moment. But if you can sell that image better to citizens, you have a chance. So my sense is that this will be very close. And at that space, I don't really know how it will go. Most analysts, particularly most analysts here in Turkey, think this is long a win for the opposition. And that may well be the case, because I haven't had a chance to travel around the country and to get a pulse of. But what I do know is that several constituencies will play a role. You already have secular, urban secularists here, let's say 40%. You already have conservative, Sunni conservative nationalists, let's say another 40%. And in the middle, you have Kurds, younger people who will vote for the first time. And you also have disgruntled conservatives, urban middle class, because AKP has been in power for 20 years, that it also has its own conservatives, the urban conservatives that are not happy about the direction of the country. So whoever wins this swing voter, the middle ground people, will have a chance.
All right. Yes, so that's the reason that the election is so fascinating, that on one hand it is so close, and on the other hand there's so much at stake. And now you've perfectly outlined what is or could be at stake for Turkey. If we look beyond Turkey's borders, why has this been called consistently the world's most important election in 2023, as you've also called it? What's at stake beyond Turkey?
I think Turkey's role in the geopolitical balancing act, the balance of power, is very significant. Obviously, in the Ukraine, in the Russian aggression, Russia's war on Ukraine, but also in all types of other matters, as a middle power, a sort of a rising power in its own geography, with I would say regional ambitions, leadership ambitions, with close links to the Middle East, the countries, and military presence in some parts of the Middle East, but also close links to the Balkans and South Caucasus, a country that has very much dissented from the Western consensus on Russia. Turkey's not going with sanctions. It has tripled its trade with Russia. It's playing a balancing act between Russia and Ukraine, or Russia and the West, as is selling weapons to Ukraine, but on the other hand, close cooperation with Moscow. In fact, 2 weeks ago, Russians opened Turkey's first nuclear reactor in a ceremony that Putin took part in by video link, owned and operated by Russia. So, Turkey is important because it's one of these middle powers, swing states. I don't really, use the term global south, because it lumps much of the world population under one banner. But a middle power makes sense. It's countries like India, Turkey, Indonesia, Brazil that have their own heft now, certainly rising economic powers, that will determine to an extent how our effort in this long-term struggle against the authoritarian system and model that is provided by Russia and China, our ability to prevail in that long war will in part depend on our proposition to these countries, are having them on board, whether or not we can have them on board. Obviously, another issue is Turkey is always important for Europe. Yes, it has been diverging from the transatlantic consensus, but it's still a NATO country. It is a very important economic player when it comes to Europe. Europe is Turkey's top trading partner, but also Europeans are top investors in Turkey, and particularly Germany, but not only Germany. So there's an economic, there's been a customs union, free market, an expanded free market since 1995. And I think, you know, in the immediate terms, we have issues like what happens in Syria with normalization efforts, you know, with the Arab state, what happens in Sweden's accession into entry into NATO, what happens in the sort of very delicate and dangerous escalation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, in all of these issues, and in things like Libya and Turkey is relevant. So, and the Black Sea grain deal and so on. So I think we can talk about these issues. And I saw that there was a question about Sweden and Finland, but I'll let you guide us.
No, it's a very convincing case that Turkey is extremely relevant. And just to remind us all, it's a member of NATO, the OECD, the G20, has been an EU candidate since 1999, has pursued closer ties with Russia in recent years, led a more assertive and interventionist foreign policy. But just to finish on that thought, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience. Given this relevance on the regional and perhaps even global stage, what would be the practical difference between an Erdogan president and a government led by Kılıçdaroğlu?
Yes, this is an important issue. Obviously, there are differences, and some level of would be some level of continuity if there would be a post-Erdogan government. The most obvious one is a desire to tilt towards Europe, pivot back to Europe, and I don't think Europe is prepared for this. But I think one of the key foreign policy goals of the opposition coalition, you know, domestically, they want to reverse Turkey's democratic backsliding. But externally, what they say they want to do is resuscitate Turkey's EU accession process, push ahead on things like, you know, expanding the customs union agreement. Visa-free travel is often something they talk about. I mean, I think there can be movement in all these chapters. You know, we all know that there is an enlargement fatigue, if not a full stop, in Europe, and that obviously Turkey is a difficult issue on so many levels. And you know, with the war in Ukraine, but also with Ukraine, Moldova, and these countries also now knocking on Europe's door. But, you know, there will be a push from Turkey to now do that customs union modernization, upgrade Turkey's free trade agreement. There will be a push for, you know, visa-free travel. Where were we? The next government would say. When it comes to Russia and the war, I think they also would have to do some type of balancing act, but maybe tilt towards NATO, tilt towards Europe a little bit. By that, I mean this. Turkey's vulnerability, Turkey is so exposed to Russia now, so vulnerable, that President Erdogan has so increased Turkey's, I think, economic and strategic vulnerability that no government can afford to break ties with Russia, to antagonize Putin, or even to stop the economic and energy relationship. And it's more than that. You know, Russians are now running two wars in Turkey's north and south. So Turks are treading on this space very cautiously. They don't want Russia to have control of Black Sea, but they also understand that if they go all in for Ukraine, you know, it only takes a couple of days for Russians to send a few 100,000 Syrian refugees to Turkey's border by a couple of sorties in Idlib. So there's vulnerability, but also in terms of worldview. Obviously, President Erdogan also sees the world in a sense like Putin does. You know, he has disdain for what he calls the liberal world order or the Western-led world order, and its value propositions, and really believes that he has a better deal with Putin, with a better, you know, the handshake between the two men offers more to Turkey in his view. So, you know, if he continues, Turkish-EU relationship would, I think, continue, maybe more in transactional terms, maybe more reduced to the refugee issue. Again, the relationship with the US, Turkey's longtime partner, would continue to be somewhat distant and transactional. The question is, if there was to be an opposition win, would it be a radically different picture for the West? You know, would they look at it as a temporary thing? You know, with maybe Erdogan coming back in a year or two, or would there be a willingness to respond positively to a Turkey that may actually tilt towards Europe? Not fully pivot, but tilt. All of these are obviously complex issues and complex questions. You also have Aegean, Turkish-Greek tensions, Eastern Mediterranean, the energy equation, Syria, and so on and so forth. But I think it would be a very important and relevant issue for Europe as well.
Yes, these are also very interesting questions, and I find it very interesting that you say Europe is not prepared. Maybe we'll get back to that later. But first, one question that we have been very concerned with in the Nordic countries, of course, is Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO. And my good colleague Lykke asked this question in the chat.
Yes, I just saw that.
What impact, if any, could the election have on Sweden's accession to NATO? Is it a given in any case, or would it make a difference whoever wins?
So when I spoke to opposition, I mean, let me first tell you the good news. I think in either case, Turkey will ratify Sweden's entry. It may not happen in time for the Vilnius summit because of the calendar and the election calendar, if there is a second round.
Which is in July, right? Yes.
If there's a second round, it's going to be end of May, in 2 weeks.
The Vilnius summit.
The Vilnius summit, yes. In July. Yes, in July. But then, you know, if you have a new parliament, we'd also have to look into how the parliament shapes up, right? I mean, you know, if it's the opposition win, do they have the majority in the parliament? The parliament would convene a week or two after elections, and then long swearing-in ceremony before they can actually start. This is a 10-day procedure. And then, you know, normally they're supposed to go into recess, but are they going to stay on to do some of the laws and changes? President Erdogan has so vilified Sweden that I cannot think any government can have as the first order of business ratification of Sweden. You know, it would have to be part of a package with very public signaling from Sweden that, you know, they understand Turkey, they take into account Turkey's considerations, etc. The one thing that can make that easier for the next government is that Sweden will pass anti-terrorism legislation. That does not necessarily mean they're passing it because of Turkey, but I think it provides a good rationale. And already Sweden, of course, has taken many steps. If it's Erdogan in opposition in the parliament, you know, he will be accusing the government of, he would be accusing them of serving their masters. He's already framing the opposition as an instrument of the West, of United States, and and Europe, and it'll put up a hard opposition. If it's an Erdogan win, I think we would still get Sweden eventually, but the timing of it would be tricky, in the sense that President Erdogan would want to see something from United States. He's always wanted to triangulate this relationship. He never thought it was just enough between Turkey and Sweden. He would want perhaps, if it's a contested win, a recognition and legitimacy. But more importantly, he would want a signal that US is willing to sell Turkey F-16s, this mega purchase, something in the vicinity of 20 billion purchase of F-16s and upgrade for its existing F-16 fleet, which is being held by US Congress. I think he would try to negotiate for that. Of course, these are tricky issues, and maybe there is a middle ground that Biden administration can signal that they can deliver modernization kits, but not, the sale is up to Congress, or maybe they'll hope, but it's hard for me to say where this would go. But he would want to negotiate, intensely negotiate, before the Vilnius summit.
All right. So just before we return to domestic politics, about which we have a question in the chat, whether or not Erdogan would accept losing. Let me ask you, how does geopolitics look from Ankara? How does it see itself? Does it see itself as a non-aligned player, somehow closer to the West? You mentioned that it's a middle power, and that Kılıçdaroğlu wants to move it closer to the EU. But would you characterize it as a non-aligned country in the current context, or is it still somehow closer to the West as being part of NATO and an EU candidate?
You mean if Kılıçdaroğlu wins, would it still be non-aligned?
Yes.
On certain elements, President Erdogan has really, in particular over the past 10 years, been able to convince Turkish citizens that its future, that it is a solo power, that its future is, its destiny is to be a regional hegemon, and that will only happen if it can unleash itself from the shackles that it had for the past 70 years or 100 years, depending on where you start the calendar. But definitely, there have been AKP officials from Erdogan's ruling Justice and Development Party that have that have characterized the period of secular republic as a parenthesis. And if we end up closing the parenthesis, it's essentially restoring, bringing back the Turkish Empire. So that is a constant theme, and something that we see a lot in the messaging. And it's hard to change a country overnight, in part because I'm not yet certain that, we can turn the clock back and get Europe to the place it was in terms of welcoming Turkey as a member of the club back 20 years ago. Depending on what the new thinking is, new proposition is, it is possible for Turkey to position itself as a regional power that has a very close alignment with Europe, or even further, pivot even further. But that will in part depend on what the EU puts on the table for Turkey.
Yes, and Europe is, after all, the by far biggest trading partner of Turkey, even if its dependencies on Russia and its technology and money has increased in recent years. So we have another question in the chat from Hans, who asked exactly whether or not Erdogan would accept losing the election, or what we could expect if he were not to. And as you said, there's the first round is on Sunday, and there's a potential which is quite likely, it seems, from the polls, a second round on May 28th. What would you expect if the election results were close? How would Erdogan react, and what would we see in those coming days?
So this is the question everyone asks me, and most people assume he won't. My answer is a little more nuanced, which is that if it's a very close, very neck and neck situation, President Erdogan would do what Donald Trump has done and what Bolsonaro tried to do and say, you know, actually I won. If a close election, 100, you know, a few less than 1%, I think, would be contested. But if the difference is over 1.5%, 2%, and these are arbitrary figures that I use for myself, there's no scientific way of explaining, but I'm fairly certain that if the difference is big enough for the opposition, over 2%, he would accept it. This is a man who's built his entire legitimacy on elections and the ballot, and basically has sold the idea that if you win, you get to do anything, more of a majoritarian democracy. He could not, and the system and bureaucracy would not you know, let anyone defy the results if the difference is bigger than 2%. The most dangerous thing for Turkey is the period between the two elections, if there's a runoff. I think because the society is so worked up and both sides so galvanized, I worry about the repetition of the type of events that, as we've seen in Erzurum, where a group of people have thrown stones and actually injured some opposition supporters at a rally of Istanbul Mayor İmamoğlu. And, you know, this type of stuff would, of course, be hugely intimidating to voters. And the other bad scenario for Turkey is something that is so neck and neck, so close, like the Istanbul elections in 2019, when in the first round it was very close and President Erdogan said, you know, I won, they stole, we repeat the elections. So the answer to that question depends on how big the divide is. Opposition, in order to win, they need to win big. There is no possibility to win by a fraction of the vote.
All right. And no matter who wins the election, how do you see the coming months after? You have described Turkey as, you know, once it had a dream of becoming a European China, with a lot of production for Europe and close trade ties and so on. And now there's a risk that it might become a European Argentina because of its steep economic problems with high inflation, weakening exchange rate, and so forth. This will persist, of course, no matter who wins. Do you what do you see coming in terms of, you know, the condition for the country and its stability, and as a consequence of those economic problems, its abilities to play on a regional or global scale, given all these domestic issues?
So Turkey has huge pluses in this geopolitical environment when United States and now increasingly Europe is talking about decoupling from China or de-risking, as Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, has recently called it, as the Biden administration is looking to diversify its production chains away from China, and Europe increasingly interested in this conversation. There's an opportunity for Turkey because it is not just any middle power. It's a country on the edge of Europe with a customs union for Europe, but also a country that has a skilled workforce and a broad production base. This is a country that already produces that, you know, cement and, you know, telephones and cars, etc. I would say its economy has been going in the wrong direction. It's now, dizzy on sugar high, in part because of the choices President Erdogan has made. Really prioritizing growth instead of sort of fiscal discipline, which has created a macro mess in the economy, but also relying on construction and big infrastructure projects as opposed to expanding Turkey's manufacturing base and technological investments. Turkey needs to do what China did 20 years ago, 30 years ago, invest in technology, subsidize it if necessary, and get to a higher level of industrial output. The opposition, in my view, has a better chance of that based on what they're saying and their economic program platform. There seems to be an understanding that they need to transition to a manufacturing economy and with high value added goods. But they will have the problem of being, it's a coalition of 6 parties. Any coalition is tough, but imagine a coalition of 6. President Erdogan would have a harder time, I think, doing this, because he's really run the economy. He's really micromanaged the economy, ran it like as if he was the mayor of Turkey, wanting to be the ultimate decision maker on all small and big investment decisions, and who gets to which country, which company gets what contracts, and which rules are reversed, and who gets what interest rates are to be picked by which bank. I mean, it's just quite a mess right now. But there is a very sound financial system and banking industry, and a very capable professional class. So you need a steady hand and a quick signaling to global markets that Turkey is returning to rules-based economic system. I have to say, whoever wins, I would expect they will face economic headwinds, particularly the devaluation of Turkish lira is almost unavoidable. Hopefully, if there is good signaling, and I think, and a market rally, hopefully Turkey can avoid a balance of payments crisis. But it's a tough job. You don't want to be Turkey's next economy minister, I think. The country has been running on sugar high, which is subsidized by the direct funds that have come from UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Azerbaijan, and Russia. So, when this stops, we're going to face the reality, which is that the country is broken and all.
All right, we only have a few minutes left, so I'll ask you 2 final questions and ask you to be brief as we're running out of time. First of all, these economic issues, do they have consequences, or would they have big consequences for migration, which is a big theme in the Turkish election as well? And what would be the impact for Europe on this new migration policy? And second, as a last question, should Erdogan lose, and should he accept losing and leave the palace, so to speak? What do you think would be his legacy in Turkey?
Let me answer the second question quickly. I think, obviously the answer depends on how well his party does in the polls. But my sense is that, sorry, I realized I forgot to turn on the. Sorry, if Erdogan loses, depends on how well his party does in the parliament. But if he controls a majority stake in parliament, his path will be like that of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. Plot his return, hoping that maybe the economic situation and the internal divisions within the opposition would eventually force new elections. That's one idea. Second issue is refugees. I think we have to acknowledge the fact that there are very strong anti-refugee sentiments right now. That's become a big political issue in the country. And basically all political parties are running on some type of a proposal for refugee returns to Syria. In particular for Syrian refugees, they're all proposing various plans to send people back to Syria, voluntary returns. The main opposition and Erdogan's party says, but others say we'll send them back in a year, in 2 years, we'll send them back overnight. I don't think any of these things will happen, but I think it's important to understand that Europe's 2016 deal with Turkey is not the end of that story, that there is, that there is too big of a political surge in the country now against this particular agreement. And so I would think that the next government would do two things. Try to renegotiate with Europe and encourage more Europeans to take on some of the burden, and also negotiate with Syria in order to see if they could create better conditions for voluntary return of refugees. So far, Syria has not had a good track record on that. But the idea that is being increasingly voiced by both government and opposition people is, well, since Arab countries are discussing normalization with Syria, eventually, there will be reconstruction of Syria and international aid, and for areas under Assad control or areas outside of Assad control, and that this might encourage refugee returns. We know from examples like this that refugees, a large percentage of them do not want to return to their original countries. I don't envision a situation in which people are put on buses and sent back to Syria. But I do think that we're going to see movement on normalization between Turkey and Syria, and an effort and a Turkish push to get Europe and United States to consider reconstruction of Syria, which may provide or stop the further flows, or may provide at least some people to incentivize some people to return. I think in Europe, people think the refugee issue is closed because it's done and it's finished because of the 2016 agreement with Turkey. But in Turkey, I think it's just a daily drama and a huge sort of driving force in politics.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion, and we're so pleased that you would enlighten us on all these issues. It will be very exciting to see if we get a clear result on Sunday, or whether we'll have to wait another 2 weeks. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who listened in. We will we'll be back later this year with more coverage of European elections when Poland and Spain go to the polls. But first, we'll have to see if Erdogan survives. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erasmus, and thanks to Europa for making this possible. And good luck to Turkey.
Good luck to Turkey.